Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome once again to another industry briefing from Commio. Eric, you and I, we were sitting around, looking at ideas for this slot, and I think it's really important sometimes to go back to basics, and especially given some recent industry events, it seemed like this topic was really ripe for presenting because for all of us on the line today and who are watching after the fact, you think about it for a second. If you take a breath and you think about the fact that so many of us have voice as one of the centerpieces of our communication channels, either for our application, for our company, for our contact center, and disaster recovery, sort of the ability to weather any sort of a service outage, is something that keeps us up at night. As a provider, it obviously keeps us up to make sure that we're delivering that really essential uptime for all of you, but also down at your level, especially for folks that are working with different providers that maybe are single threaded, and we'll get into this in a little bit. It's something you can really lose sleep over. So we really wanted to come to our audience and talk about how you can ensure your voice services from dial to delivery. So that's from what used to be called origination and termination to inbound to outbound and sort of the new parlance. So with that in mind, I already sort of referred to it. You and I both know, Eric, last week AT&T had an issue. It was something on their back end. I think it was a software update that they pushed out that caused that to happen, if I read it in the press correctly. That kind of that kind of thing happens, right? Out there in the world.
When it first happened, I think there were some rumors because I guess there was some solar flares
Right.
going on
Right.
right around that time. People thought it
Yeah.
might be related to that.
Right.
You know, I hope this webinar isn't in bad taste. I mean, we've had this on the books for a while. It just happens to coincide with, a recent thing. There's plenty of examples, we could bring up and
Yeah.
and talk about how this has had effects in the industry.
That's right. And that's really why it's important to think about disaster recovery. So when something happens, and invariably something will happen, it's, what are the steps proactively that you can take to mitigate it, both from the inbound side and the outbound side? Because, as you can see here, even Gartner says, look, for every minute that you're down, especially if you're running a high touch contact center, for instance, you're losing anywhere from, $5,500 a minute on up. And those costs really do add up over time. I just and on top of it too, Eric, I think, and we'll talk about this later as well, is part of the AT&T issue was that there were some 911 implications where people weren't able to call 911,
Oh well.
is which is also very troubling. So the question is, how can you route around that? So really, nowadays, and I think you'd agree, Eric, it does kind of feel like in some ways that the solutions that are out in the marketplace, it seems kind of difficult to be able to ensure that redundancy from inbound to the outbound side. It's harder than it probably should be, right?
Yeah, I would agree. I'd say I think there's definitely best practices. I think a lot of people are doing a lot of the right things. I think there are misconceptions about certain product lines where people have just sort of accepted it is the way it is, and
Right.
they're not actively hunting for ways to improve the situation and redundancy around certain products. Um, and I think, let's be frank, it's not like these things are occurring on a daily basis, network wide outages.
Yeah.
It's not something that's happening in mass. We're not here to
Right.
instill fear in people.
Right.
I mean, most people do a really good job, and but it's true. There's no such thing as one provider of voice and communications or voice and messaging services that is good all the time or good in every location, right? And that's kind of the mantra that we live by. But go ahead, Tim.
Absolutely. That's right. So if we start with this, which I think is a good way to start, is I think most of us that have been in the industry longer than a few years understand that from an outbound perspective, having outbound redundancy is baked into a lot of products that you're going to come across. So I feel like 6, 7, 8 years ago, it was fairly normal if you ran a contact center, you might go out there and actually do a contract with AT&T or Verizon or one of these providers. And maybe you'll add a second one, right? In case so you do have a failover. So from an outbound perspective, sort of having that redundancy has been fairly standard practice, right?
Yeah, I mean, for most people that watch our content, they already understand what failover is. For those that don't, such as our software as a service companies who are typically connecting to a CPaaS type solution, might not be so familiar with the terminology and everything like that. You know, for a second here, I'd just like to define it. When you go to make an outbound phone call, it's going to attempt a provider, right, on the service that you're using. The question is what happens if that provider is unable to connect that call for whatever reason? No response, outage, degraded quality, solar flare, you name it, whatever it is, in real time, does it instantaneously attempt another provider so that you're creating a seamless experience for the end user? They're never the wiser that multiple have been attempted. I think this is probably one of the most common things that people are doing on their own.
Yeah.
But what was your question, Tim? I don't know if I answered it. I want to make sure we define.
No, I think just in general, just from a high level, the fact that I think most people who have a critical voice application understand what outbound redundancy looks like, and to a certain extent what their options are, because we'll talk about some when we get a little farther in, but nowadays it's not just one or two providers you can have from an outbound redundant perspective. You can have 20, 30, 40, right? So you can create that.
That's right. You can have a lot. There are some complexity to adding that many, providers, and whether you have the equipment and the setup to do that. But
Yeah.
you know, one thing I think we hear often, we have the privilege of being a part of the conversation where, you know, customers are sharing with us exactly what they've done and their journey to get where they are today, what they're planning on doing and going forward. We see it all, we hear it all. And one of the most common themes when people first come to us is, especially with a problem, is, for the most part, everything I have works pretty great, pretty happy with everybody I have, pretty happy with my setup. I'm just having this particular problem, right? And if it's related to outbound voice, it might be, I'm just having trouble getting calls connected here more
Right.
reliably. That's
Mhm.
a very common thing. And, it starts off with, well, we feel like we've done everything right. We've got name brand, provider of voice here, and name brand provider of voice in case they don't work, and next name brand, provider in line. Like, I've got three really good quality providers. How come I'm not, able to just do everything I want to be doing and have the quality experience that I want? And honestly, it's very common that that actually occurs, because what tends to happen, especially with call degradation, a service outage, or things like that, is you find that those three name brand providers of that voice service on outbound for you share a common connection into the location that you're going to. So where one has a problem, the other two are likely to have the same type of problem. It's like one of the most common things that people come into us with is, hey, I've got this very specific use case issue that I'm trying to solve. And what we find in those scenarios is it may take 5 to 13 in order to reliably get those calls in that location, because you're looking for somebody who has an alternate connection into that locale, right?
Mhm.
And Tim, you mentioned 40. I don't know if to be frank, I don't know of even any major brand carrier, outside of us, but who actually goes to the depth of 40.
Right.
But getting there to, like, 10 to 13, that's where you should really feel like, you've really got really solid coverage, especially if you've got, the facilities base, the big facilities base, and the great aggregator carriers that are connecting to the local sort of incumbents in all the different areas.
Right. And if we take it another step down the ladder, Eric, and I think people understand that about multiple carriers, not all good at everywhere, have as many as you can, right, to get those calls completed, even to really rural areas, which we see as an issue with our customers that they can solve. But it's also this other notion of being able to set up a routing system for yourself that really focuses on reducing costs, right? And that's been around a long time. So you put a number of those carriers, into a routing engine, and then, try to use that to drive your costs down, right? And I think there's some misconceptions about that um, in the current marketplace.
Yeah, yeah. So least cost routing can be quite the
Yeah,
dirty phrase, if you will, in the business.
right.
I think anytime you're talking about something that is lowering costs, the immediate, you know, mental shift is, well, then I must be getting inferior quality, right?
Yeah,
Um, you know, again, I'm just talking about what people should be doing to improve their situation as far as, reliability goes and redundancy goes. And I think least cost routing plays a really valuable role in preventative measure when it comes to routing your calls.
Hmm.
So least cost routing, as it exactly as it describes, if you've got your own equipment and it has the ability to make decisions on which provider to use for which call, you know, you have options. You can set, a primary provider. I use this one every single time. If they don't work, I use this one, and if they don't work, I use this one. And another methodology is I'm going to route to a carrier based on where they're most cost competitive for that destination. And I think the quality side of things, people are going to argue, oh, I just always want to go with the best provider. And then, if they're not good, I'll go with the second best and then with the third best. And I'll always push back on that in the sense that show me a provider that's good all the time and everywhere. I mean, each provider has strengths. They bring something particular to the table. They bring their direct connection routes to the table. Why would you ever want to route to carrier A when it's ultimately destined for carrier B? Wouldn't you just be better off routing to B? And there's no sort of routing table for that, right? Oh, I'm just going to route to the carrier who's got the facility there or whatever it might be.
Right.
And we'd make the argument that least cost routing actually does that for you, right?
Hmm.
With an exception. The exception is almost 9 times out of 10, if I talk to somebody who has had a bad experience with least cost routing and they've been trying to build out an alternative routing plan, they share their experience that, hey, you know, I just always sent my traffic to this very inexpensive kind of low grade provider. And so least cost routing just wasn't working for me. I was having a bad experience. And that's the problem. It can be
Right.
very difficult to least cost route on your own if you don't have the buy power to get a level playing field among all the premium providers. So if you
Hmm.
don't have that ability to do that, um, then I do recommend primary, secondary, tertiary sort of method, of redundancy inside of there. But if you
Hmm.
can get a level playing field, what rises to the surface is the most cost competitive carrier is the one who's a more direct connection, right? There are
Right.
less hands in the cookie jar. Therefore, their cost plusing the model is much lower than anybody else, competing for it. The easiest example for that is if you have a Verizon connection, there's plenty of other providers, that you can have in there that are called quote unquote premium, right? But why would you ever send a call to a Verizon enterprise customer or a mobile subscriber? Why would you ever send that to a different provider that's ultimately destined for the Verizon network? You're just introducing more of a chance of something going wrong, right? So when I talk about it being a preventative measure, it's like you want to take out as many variables out of the equation that could go wrong. And anytime you are daisy chaining your call together to get to the destination between multiple providers, you're just giving there an opportunity for each one of those to drop the ball, right? And that's the most common things we see.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And lastly, I think on outbound, I think there's no argument against the fact that, there are lots of pros of having a diversification of vendors, right? Like you're spreading your risk, more options are always better. And then intelligently routing through them, I think is really where the key comes in, right?
It is. And there's so many fun acronyms in communications, telecommunications, things like that. I try to avoid them at all costs because I've been told numerous times, you acronym me to death, Eric.
Hmm.
But, you know, in simple terms, when you talk about diversification, there's the obvious names, and I think most people can pen them down on paper. It's the house brands that they know, maybe some they, especially if our software as a service companies haven't heard of before, like Level 3 and things like that. They want to get those down. But there's also particular carriers that focus on getting regional providers, like getting more direct connections into regional providers. And I think of these as like the big providers are kind of the bricks on the wall, and the select aggregation providers become the mortar between the bricks, right? They really lock it all in together and bring that sort of quality in the mix. The other reason for diversification is just the absolute obvious thing on here, right? If you're overly reliant on a single provider, it's just a matter of time. Somebody's going to, you know, like AT&T accidentally update a routing table. By the way, that happened to Level 3, one of the largest networks out there.
Yeah.
Somebody updated the routing table, sort of fat fingered it, however that might have happened. And, it brought that network to a screeching halt. That affected almost, every service out there, right? When it comes to major telecommunications and connection services. So
Right. Yeah.
these are
And
things to consider.
and not to mention things like DDoS attacks as well that have also been noted in the last couple of years. So, it,
Yeah. So, I just, I'd say it would be incorrect for us to say that this is like, occurring on a daily basis, right?
Hmm.
Sure, you could make the argument that there are select outages. You can go to any major provider status page and see what's happening. Oh, Skokie, Illinois is down. Oh, we're having some issues in the Los Angeles region. There's those kinds of things, for sure. But the major outages are very infrequent, very few and far between. But when I talk to people about what they're delivering to the end user, they're talking to me about mission critical services, right? These are services that are powering educational institutions. They are sending out emergency alerts. They are, you know, nonprofits. They are major enterprises that just being down for an hour, is incredibly costly. And so, if for no other reason than the fact that, mitigating this risk to a degree is just protecting your brand and protecting your revenues. And we should be asking our providers the hard questions about, hey, if I am overly dependent on a single connection, what are you doing to help me prevent this? Because they've all got a pretty good story, but they've all had the experience of going down, and you need to be aware and understand, how that could happen and how it might affect your customer base.
Yeah, back to your example, Eric, again, if you're aware and you're having trouble delivering calls to Skokie, right, Illinois, the
Right.
question is, do you have a solution in place where having that knowledge doesn't result in you filing a support ticket and waiting a day or two and praying, but can you proactively take steps to go in and say that MPA, that NXX, sorry, there's my three-letter acronyms. Can you say for the next day or two at this area code or, NXX level, can I take a carrier out of route that I know is having trouble and solve it myself? And that's possible today. That's absolutely possible.
That is possible today. That is
Yeah.
possible with hardware and equipment. There are solutions out there. I'll
Yeah.
throw out a plug for Commio. We offer stuff like that. We could talk to you about it, but
Yep.
it's yeah, it's do you have that connection? So Tim, I think what you're really bringing up, which is such a fantastic point, is you not only want to talk to your provider about what are you doing for me on the front end of like how are you helping me mitigate this risk. Talk to me about the redundancies. Talk to me about real-time failover, transparency, and things like that, right? Then on the back end, you're talking about what we call ticket to resolution time, like the time between it takes between having an actual problem and being able to resolve it. What does that actually look like?
Right.
And there's some very straightforward statistics that the industry at large on a major event is can be like an 11 to 12 hour turnaround time to get that fixed. So maybe that doesn't impact your business, but if you're sitting there saying 12 hours of being out is something that could be very harmful to my business and brand, then you need to be looking for alternative solutions to just that
That's right.
single provider.
You got it. You got it. Well, if we move, excuse me, if we move from from outbound to inbound, this is where things get interesting. So you think about it, Eric, how we would define inbound, it's basically you've got your phone number or phone numbers, right? And that's, what people are going to call to get in touch with you. And the question is, you know, you're basically when you get a phone number from a provider, it today to most people feels like, another single point um of failure, right? Like if something happens, and people can't call your number and get through, what can you do? Right? So that's really the question.
Yeah, so I think on outbound it might be a little bit of a rehash for people, and a lot of people on this call might even be saying, very well aware of this, I'm already taking steps and I'm doing things like that. What really strikes me about inbound is almost nobody has a plan on inbound.
Yeah.
And I think the industry in general has encouraged them to think of this as just accept that there is single point of failure, potential here, and that's just okay. Um, I don't agree with that. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. Let's not name any carriers in here because really it could happen to almost any, brand and things like that. But one of the primary, underlying networks in the US, suffered a DDoS attack. They weren't the only one. There was many that suffered it.
Right.
And in conjunction, you saw all these platforms out there. They provide, millions and millions of numbers to lots of different platforms and things like that. And you saw all these various platforms, putting up service notices to their customer. Hey, we're having outages, we're having these things like that. So like Depending on what type of product line you're using, whether you're directly connected to, a wholesale telecommunications provider, whether you're working with a CPaaS, these things can trickle through. And, in this case, it was a DDoS attack. It could have just as easily been, we've got to update the servers. It's going to take us, 12 hours. It could have just as easily been, we got to send trucks out, to,
Right.
to correct the fiber, whatever it might be, you know, but it had a major impact on so many, buyers of these services and so many end users. And at the end of the day, a lot of the messaging that went out from people who were suffering from this just kind of is the way it is. And so there's options out there. I know there's a tendency to really leverage your buy power against one inbound provider who provides you phone numbers and inbound minutes, and leverage your buy power as good as you can to get as good a contract as you can to stay competitive. And again, if redundancy isn't necessarily a priority for you on inbound, there's probably nothing wrong with that methodology. Most providers are good, and they're good for long periods of time, usually years, without suffering problems. Um, but if you're offering mission critical services, SLA agreements, there's financial commitments in those SLA agreements, things like that, you're going to want to start to think about how you're going to mitigate that risk.
Right.
And, you know, I'll spare you a big Commio plug right now, but we have some things that specifically address that. Of course, that's why we're here. We're talking about stuff. But, at the same time, I don't even think you need Commio to begin to start thinking about how you diversify on that. Right.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's recommended at least to have three providers in this. And it serves for a variety of reasons. Number one, phone number availability. Generally, what you find on a carrier is that they have a lot of good numbers. Even the biggest ones have got a lot of good footprint, but they don't have, you know, numbers everywhere, right? They cover 60% of the population or something like that. Those are like the good ones, right? 70% of the population. And if we don't have it, we'll aggregate through another provider and buy you numbers there or something like that. I recommend dealing directly with the on-net footprint, just to define that. It's their phone numbers. So the on-net footprint of providers, and having multiple diverse providers for that, right?
Right.
And then randomizing it to some degree for your customers, right? I think even Zoom, we're good friends with Zoom. I think even Zoom on their numbers for the calling at one point, I think they told us, they randomize the providers through it so that in case they ever have an outage on one of those networks, people will still be able to call in on the meetings because, all of them can't go down at the same time. And we have to
Right.
have the same methodology.
Right.
Years ago, I saw a customer suffer an outage. They came to us, of course, after they had this problem, but suffered an outage. And what they basically found is that their support team could not handle the volume of traffic coming in when their numbers went down. Right. So now they got a lot of angry customers who are saying, we can't even get a response out of you. They couldn't barely keep up with the ticketing system inside of it, things like that. Now, had they just diversified with three providers, they would have had 1/3 of those support tickets, coming across the mix.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So I think
Fighting a
it
little cold. Sorry, everybody.
no, you sound fine. You sound fine. But I
Okay.
think I think what you're trying to get at here, Eric, which I agree, is now that we're looking at both ends of the call, again, from dial to delivery, excuse me, it's really looking at making sure that you're working with one of these, what we would call a better provider, which is, and get down to brass tacks. It's US based support that you can get somebody on the phone or at least send that email and get a response and get a technician when you need it. It's being able to take control of your calling, through a platform or through an API directly, ideally. But if you can't get something fixed, you want to be able to get somebody on the phone. Uh, but you want to have all these in place so that again, you can sleep better at night, know that you have control both at the origination of the call and the termination. Um, but it's nice to know now that on the inbound side, we have some solutions available. And we'll kind of take a snapshot of what that looks like in just a minute. But let's talk about toll free too, Eric. So, there's a handful of RESP orgs out there in the world, and that means that they're able to get toll free numbers. It used to be those lovely 800 numbers, and now you can't find those, 866, 888, all those other numbers now. But
Yep.
really, beyond just number availability, you want to be able to get the numbers when you need them. But it's also about disaster recovery. So again, I think in the old days, Eric, you'd agree, like, we work with, a couple big airlines, a couple big insurance companies, either directly or through, secondary folks. And those folks, used
Political.
to,
Yep.
yeah, yeah, they used to go out and be like, all right, I got three numbers, or one number for like whatever, my airline, and I'm going to get that from AT&T. And again, there we go again with that single point of failure. So again, the idea is you want to work with a provider that can give you access to all five, toll-free um, providers out there, right? And really use that for disaster recovery.
Yeah, there's five primary. Absolutely.
Yeah,
I know we're running long here, but I'll keep it
yeah,
real short. You know, just like inbound, when I said, you want to deal with somebody as an on-net footprint, in toll free, you really want to deal with somebody who's a REST work, right? So this is somebody who can actually
Hmm.
manipulate the logic for how a call gets to your toll free number. Um, just because they are a REST board doesn't mean that they built the tools to actually be able to change that. Oftentimes they're working with spreadsheets, but let's be fair and at least say that most of them are doing some level of sophistication. What that basically means is in the event that you have an outage on your toll free number related to a weather event, like remember CenturyLink had one on the East Coast.
right,
It's a weather event, something's occurring, that they have the technical capability to go in and say, I don't want to use CenturyLink anymore. Let's use AT&T instead, right?
right, right.
Um, and that can restore services. I mean, these are customers who are using it on their products, like on the credit cards, and there's things like that, like they're using it for like car support, in traffic accidents. Like again, you can't have these things down. A lot of times, a toll-free number is the very definition of a mission critical, number for a business, right?
Yeah,
And so, at the very least, you need that. I'd say that the next level that comes in that is, um, you know, where they diversify the inbound routing of your number. So when you get calls coming in on your toll free number, it isn't just coming across one. It depends on where it's coming from, but it's coming across different ones. That means, again, it gives you a measure of protection in case there is a complete outage on one of them. You never go completely down. You're still getting calls in from the other providers that diversifies it. And then, of course, we have some solutions that go beyond that. And maybe there's like one other player in the space that does a little bit more sophisticated stuff as well.
exactly. But again, it's good to know whether it's a domestic, 10-digit number or a toll-free number. We have options again for this,
That's right.
for this redundancy.
That's right.
So, and let's talk about technology. So, Eric, we've been talking about these, I think, this whole time, but here's a great snapshot. This is inside of our platform, for instance. It's just good to know that nowadays, it's not just, a bunch of copper wires, crudely like the, 1200s, uh, welded together to complete a call, and it's not a cup with a string. Now there's, with the advent of voice over, internet protocol, good old VoIP, and platforms and APIs, now there are automated software powered solutions that really bring all these solutions into focus and make it actually pretty simple, very straightforward, but powerful to bring all these carriers together in one place and take control and not only, again, allow you to sleep better at night, reduce operational burdens, as we say here, improve response times, but really take control. So it's kind of an exciting time to have access to some of these tools that, frankly, you're on the calls every day. A lot of people don't even know these abilities exist, and they're all powered by software.
That's right.
Yeah. So let's take a step through, and I appreciate the time check. Is that let's talk about Commio. I think hopefully we've earned the right by this time in the session together. But here's a great example, Eric, which we love to show people. Is that here's a snapshot of our network, in a graphical form where again this is showing our inbound side of things. Where again, if you have an issue in a given marketplace, more than 80% of the U.S. If you're having trouble, people can't call in for whatever reason, and you need to move a phone number from one provider to another, we can actually do that for you. And that was one of the reasons, Eric, I remember when I was, even before I came on board here at Commio, before we were called Think, I was looking at the online reviews for the company, and one of them was, hey, I think he said we had like 68 numbers, and we had a provider issue in our market, and I didn't know what to do. And I got in touch with you guys with those numbers. We were able to move them to another provider on the inbound side. We were back up and running within, 30 minutes. And I'm like, that's the kind of company I want to work for. that has those kinds of solutions in place for solving real business problems when they happen.
You're exactly right. I mean, the way I think about it is I think you can, like we talked about here today, there's a lot of things you can do on your own. You're probably doing some of them. You could probably be doing more, to mitigate risk and to improve your cost structure and optimize the quality that's coming across things. But I'd say the most common conversation I'm having is our partners are generally focused on their end users, their customer base, right? And they don't want to spend all their time working with carriers and creating automations and trying to, fix all that stuff.
Right.
And so, I think that's where Commio comes into play. We centralize everything into one platform. We challenge the industry norm from a technology standpoint. We're doing things that nobody else has been able to do, right? We have the largest on that footprint. We have geo redundancy on inbound phone numbers that people do not have. We have the ability to instantly restore services on those phone numbers. Wait, I'll get slapped if I say instantly. It takes 5 minutes on inbound to restore services.
Right.
But I don't know of anybody else who can do that, right?
Right. Right.
Because everybody's sort of like slinging a network, like, oh, I'm slinging, this infrastructure that I built out in this particular location. We've got multiple redundant infrastructure in locations, so we're actually able to switch between them
Yep.
and instantaneously restore services. We don't know of anybody else who's able to do that. On our outbound, we centralize all of that from both the real time failover in the beginning part, you know, curating the right list of providers. We've got all those things interconnected for you, so you don't even have to think about it. You just click a button and you're just instantly working with 40 providers. And then on the back end, let's say something weren't to go wrong, because were to go wrong. We don't live with our heads in the sand. Something will happen eventually, right? You're going to judge us based on how quickly we can resolve that problem and how permanently we can resolve that problem. So
Yep.
we built the entire product around making that process simple. My customer doesn't want to wait 17 minutes. They don't want to wait 11 hours,
Yeah.
right? They want to solve it instantaneously. And so we build that into the platform. And then, of course, with the toll-free product, it'd be nice if you knew what everybody was doing. And even some of these people who say they've got these like, Assure products or whatever it might be, they're kind of saying, trust me, I promise I'm doing a really good job on the back end. For us, it's entirely transparent. Toll-free
Yep.
numbers are protected. They're registered across every provider. If there's ever an event of something, we'll probably solve it for you. But if you identify it before us, you can absolutely solve it yourself inside of our platform with a click of a button.
That's right. That's right. And as you know, you mentioned earlier that, one of our, newer types of customers that have come to us in the last few years are, platforms um, that, require real granular control. So some of these guys have hundreds or thousands of customers that are out in the field and are working in rural areas. Back to the Skokie example. And if suddenly something happens in Skokie and they're a business owner, but they're using this software platform to get calls delivered to their phone, what are they going to do? Or they're going to call the platform and say, I'm not getting calls from my customers in Skokie. I'm trying to set up my appointments. Well, what's great is that the owners of that platform can go into ours and say, hey, in Skokie, for the next 2 or 3 days, take this, carrier out of route, and then the calls start flowing again.
Yeah.
And
Or they can have our support team do it for them. I mean,
right,
it's just like
right,
it's all built to be,
yeah, right,
incredibly simple, non-telecommunications experts, like it's just instantly just
yep,
sort of an intuitive, type platform. There's one thing I did want to throw in there, Tim, because I know we're over time, but
yeah,
I think I might have ignored something that's rather important. I mean, one thing to consider is there's going to be a certain portion of customers out there that I feel a little bit stuck because I'm directly connected to a CPaaS platform, and I don't really control a lot of this kind of stuff. And we offer an integration into those platforms that then expands your suite of tools that allows you to then take on this level of control to mitigate your risk. So, don't feel, frustrated if you're connected to a CPaaS and you feel like I'm levered too heavy into this. There's nothing I can do. There are options to add enhancements in, and surprise, it actually lowers your cost overall, right? So
yeah.
it's pretty shocking product.
Well, even one quick example is that, even if your number is owned by, another provider, we can still enable text messaging on those numbers and help you get those delivered. So
That's right.
anyway, there's so many more things that people can do they don't even realize. Well, Eric, we did have a couple great questions come in, so we'll try to get through these real quick. Thanks for everybody
Sure.
sticking around. Um, So in the event of an outage or a service interruption, how quickly can inbound calls be rerouted or restored to minimize disruptions? First
Our
question.
team will only let me say 5 minutes, but it can go
Right.
faster than that.
There you go. It's that's true. You just said it. 5 minutes. That's right. Yeah, just let us know. Um, so I understand that the costs are high, but what are the actual odds of a serious or extended outage? I think that first slide answered that, which was, the average cost to a company is about $5,500, $6,000 an hour for an outage, right?
Yeah.
But it can go a lot higher. Um, let's see. So what integrations or APIs are available to seamlessly connect our systems or software with your platform for streamlined management?
Yeah. Feel
Yeah,
free to write in. We can chat with you guys, talk to you,
yeah,
all about it. Our team is fantastic. They can help you. Obviously, you can directly connect us to either your CPaaS solution, which can be done in about 60 seconds, literally
yeah,
60 seconds. We have a video to prove it. If you don't
yeah.
think if you think we're faking it.
Right.
Um, in our general connection setup, if you have a platform that you want to connect to us, like through a typical SIP connection, it's very simple and straightforward, and you can create as many connections to us as you want.
That's right. And again, most people, especially if they're high volume, interact with us through our APIs, but obviously we have a platform that mimics those capabilities as well. Or you can use
Yeah.
them together. You don't have to use one or the
Well,
other.
especially for all the things we talked about here today about like,
Yeah.
turning things on, turning things off, adjusting them. That's all API based. I mean, yes, you can go into our portal, but you can
Mhm.
also build them programmatically into your processes.
Yep. We've heard of other kinds of routing, mostly focused on reducing costs and adding multiple carriers, but Cameo says you guys offer intelligent call routing. How is that different? Oh, good question.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we don't take the typical least cost routing approach, although we do allow the customer to control that and build in a certain level of routing based on the pricing. Um, I mean, for us, I'll give it to you really quick. It starts out at the top, the curation, the list of actual providers that are in there.
Yeah.
So we have 120 connections, but we only provide our partners with 40 because those are statistically the best, providers as we go through the mix. The next level of our intelligence is it's analyzing. You might call it tickets per million, but it's basically like errors per route and things like that. And that is culling particular destinations based on a particular carrier. So we may look at Verizon and say, "We love you, Verizon, but you're not great in Nome, Alaska." So it does call those, sort of things back. Then the next tier down is now customer control. So we've curated it, we've made everything perfect for you, but at this point now, you have the choice of which providers you want into the mix. We'll consult with you on that, and it'll enable levels of failover we talked about earlier based on what providers that you select as we go through there.
Why do I need vendor diversification if I'm already working with a vendor that has numerous carriers and redundancy?
Yeah, I prefer that. That's an argument I do take a little bit of a pass on because I don't like taking away confidence that somebody has in something, and they
Hmm.
make a great argument. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, your provider's telling you a great story. I could get into this. I don't. We don't have time for it, but I could get into this across the board and talk about. There's a million reasons. Like, for example, your carrier nine, is very likely to be least cost routing on the back end. But the problem is that they're also probably doing margin protection on your calling. So
Mm.
they're not in the business of I'll get your calls completed at any cost. They're in the business of protecting their margins on their product. And
Right.
so just because they have the ability doesn't mean they're going to leverage the ability to do it. Um, and we see the stats on all the providers we're connected to over 120. And let me tell you something, none of them complete everything. It just doesn't happen. Right.
Right. That's why you need a good mix.
That's right.
Um, how do you know if you have an issue with inbound calling? And what's the process of resolving it? How long does it take? Well, we established 5 minutes ish, ish.
This is a tough one. Same
Good.
thing with toll free. You don't know the call you didn't get, right?
Right. Right.
What we found in this instance is like we monitor all of the carrier networks to see like, who's pinging them, who's up, who's down, their events and status pages. So we're often, usually hours, ahead of our partner if we're noticing anything. But and you ideally want a partner that's doing that work. But there, you know, I don't think it's as complicated as it has to be. Very often, what you will find is your end user will let you know almost immediately, and the question then becomes how quickly can you solve it, right? Can
Yep.
you solve it in virtual real time, or does it take you hours to get that thing back into play?
Hmm.
Probably the trickier one, and I won't go into that here, is when you get where a particular carrier is unable to complete the calls coming in. So we've got customers who come to us and say, for some reason, my numbers are not getting calls from AT&T
Yeah,
and things like that.
right.
And those can be extra tricky to identify. And where we've often find that for the customer that that's what's occurring versus just when we're testing out their numbers versus them finding out themselves.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Eric, thank you so much. I think I think we've educated a bunch of folks here about the opportunities that are available, the technologies that are out there for inbound and outbound redundancy. Again, controlling your calls and your numbers from dial to delivery. So, and we always just have to end with a quick note that, we'd love to consult with anybody who is, using voice services and is looking for, some additional, opportunities to sleep better at night and get some of these tools and things in place. So, if you go to our website, commio.com, just sign up and we'd love just to talk to you. Maybe there's a chance to work together, maybe there isn't, but we're just trying
They
to help people with our tools.
Yeah, to be frank, they'll bring on an engineer, which is they're much smarter than I am, right?
Yeah,
We're keeping a very high level here, but they can really dig in deep on what your particular challenge is,
yeah,
whether you're working direct with providers or a CPaaS type solution out into the marketplace today. If you're already an existing customer and you want to talk about this more in depth with your account manager or your team, ping us. We're happy to sort of dig in with you, talk to you about, strategy, risk mitigation, things like that. We have these conversations every day.
right. Well, it looks like that was all the questions, Eric. So again, thank you for your time. I know it's a busy day, and
Thanks.
thanks for everybody else for tuning in. And we did record this session, so we will be sending an email of it probably first thing in the morning tomorrow. Feel free to reply. I get every single reply. So if you have questions, whatever you'd like, I can make sure we pass it on and get you all the answers you need. So again, from
Thanks,
overcast,
everybody.
rainy Raleigh, have a great rest of your day, and,
Yeah,
and sunny Florida, Eric. That's great.
that's right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.
Appreciate it.